My name is Nicola Fairbrother. I'm the Director of Neighbourhood Bridges, a local community organization that does human rights work in the Edmonton area. Neighbourhood Bridges is a community that was built on the notion that intellectual disability is distinctly a culture, I guess, and that most people with intellectual disabilities live life in a way that we would, in any other population of people, consider to be culturally oppressed. And so the goal of our community is to support meaningful citizenship for people with intellectual disabilities using sort of conventional human rights practices, which would be unconventional in terms of the approaches used by typical social service organizations. Well, I suppose, this is sort of entirely my opinion, but I really believe quite firmly that intellectual disabilities is one of the last kind of bastions of cultural oppression in North America and likely other parts of the world, where we have come to think about certain faiths, certain sexual identities. We think about gender issues as often being sort of cultural. And even actually often people with physical disabilities are seen to have unique cultural identities, but I think that people with intellectual disabilities have not found that place in the broader community dialogue. So for me, it's an important conversation to have. The reason that I think it's important to take concrete actions around identifying intellectual disability as cultural and engaging in both dialogue and activity that sees people more engaged is pretty vital to the notion of healthy community. I think that there's always the risk when we don't value the very heterogeneous nature of all the members of our community that traditional eugenic thinking can resurface. And so when we don't have anyone, if you will, having active conversation in the public forums about culture and its value, then it's easy to dismiss terrible treatment of human beings by misremembering or refusing to think about or conceptualize the idea that human variation can be really broadly sort of understood. And the risk there is you lose generations of people, as we have historically when it comes to people with intellectual disabilities, out of malice or out of ignorance. When I think back to the early 1900s, late 1800s, where the concept of eugenics became both, I think, sort of more commonly dialogued about in public forums and then politicized and acted on. We saw eugenics legislation across North America. We saw, the Nazi regime use people with intellectual disabilities as one of the many groups of people, they murdered by engaging in those sorts of eugenics thinkings. They justified the loss of generations of different sorts of people. And while it's commonly understood that the Nazi regime and their eugenics policies resulted in the murder of many, 6 million Jews and, several 100,000 of the Roma people, as well as political activists and people who identified on the queer spectrum. It's less understood that people with intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, and mental illnesses were, heavily persecuted by the Nazis, and so generations of the wisdom of those groups of people were lost, as well as opportunities to understand and expand on our ideas of citizenship by finding resource, opportunity, and knowledge with which people with intellectual disabilities and others could participate and create a better cultural mosaic in our community as opposed to one that's dominated by visions of very narrow ideas of what is whole and what is a citizen. I think often intellectual disability is thought about or considered to be people who have lower IQ, but we understand that also can include people who have had accidents, near-death experiences, for example, and sometimes people where we don't have a really easy way to measure their IQ, for example, people with autism. I think the face of intellectual disability is 1,000-fold. In as much as there's many thousands of ways to be human, there's many thousands of ways to be someone who also has an intellectual disability. I think the contemporary connections between historical notions of eugenics and where we find ourselves today are less overt than historical examples. We aren't actively sterilizing people. We aren't institutionalizing them often in the same way. But I think the experience of people with intellectual disabilities relies heavily on the benevolence or tolerance of others. And so the right to love, the right to family, the right to meaningful employment, meaningful education is still often barriered in the experience of people with intellectual disabilities today. I do think there's an element of isolation intrinsic to the culture of intellectual disability, and I think what's really quite interesting about it is that really from diagnosis, when a child is born into a family and is identified as having an intellectual disability, that labeling and therefore that isolation is applied equally across the family. Thus we have whole generations of families who feel less like citizens, less engaged, because of their experience of being fed into a human service system that seeks, I think, only to remediate the disability and not celebrate it. I think a fair representation of how I feel about what makes a healthy community is when we appreciate and value all manner of human variation. And for me, in my life, my goal is setting my sights to seeing that happen more often for people with intellectual disabilities than it does currently. I think we've had multiple generations of people with intellectual disabilities being characterized in hugely uncharitable ways, from sort of idiot and moron to trainable, and those sorts of labels have really led, I think, a sort of more common perception that if you have an intellectual disability, you're somehow more risky, more likely to sexually offend, more likely to be victimized, more likely to be inappropriate. But that characterization, one could make an argument that it has more to do with people's experience and the teaching often of helping professionals than it has to do with who people with intellectual disabilities are. I think the stereotypes applied to people with intellectual disabilities are both misleading and damaging and create opportunities for eugenic practices to reappear in more overt ways. And they leave people, in my view, significantly more at risk of victimization, of physical and sexual abuse, and the research seems to hold that up. It's hard to quantify whether communities fear intellectual disabilities, are ignorant about intellectual disabilities, or have simply not put any thought at all into the value of people with intellectual disabilities. And I think that's an important piece of social evolution for us to challenge and try to take action around. I think there are some disturbing trends, if you will, in terms of isolating people with intellectual disabilities. Historically, we had institutions, sanatoriums as they were known, and then we had training schools. Again, we were sort of building through, the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and this notion that we could sort of remediate out, and the notion was to mend intellectual disabilities. And I think there was a lot of hope through the 70s and 80s when the community living movement took hold in North America. And I think certainly we've had some successes, but there's certainly a great degree of isolation still in the community of people with intellectual disabilities from, the education system and employment. But I think how people live, the notion that a group home is somehow sort of normative way to live, or that it's okay if you have a disability, versus the rest of us would likely not consider living that way. And those environments can be hugely isolating because they're often, your access to the world is controlled by others. I'd like to say that I was sort of planful in the work that I do today. And I do think to some degree the work that I do was informed by my childhood. I grew up, a portion of my childhood was spent in South Africa during the height of apartheid, where, eugenics and apartheid are synonyms in my view, although often people don't sort of think about apartheid in that way. And in coming to Canada and having my first experiences meeting people outside of institutions as a young person, I think I was really drawn to the idea that it was troubling to see that I, as a young person, would be out in the community choosing where I would go and what I would do. But these large, congregated groups of people with intellectual disabilities were clearly having their activities dictated by someone else. And it reminded me of the way the men who worked on my school grounds were treated, where their days were regulated by the principal of the school, essentially from dawn until dusk. And they would be punished for engaging in their own cultural practices. And there's an argument to be made that there are uniquely intellectually disabled sort of cultural practices that people have been kept from, like using their own natural language. So I think that my sensitivity came from living in a place where I lived of privilege and by privilege, but could see some of the manifest injustices where I grew up. My area of focus has always been on intellectual disability and or research related to it, although for a period of time I was the executive director of a research organization. We did a lot of work relative to poverty, and I think there's a lot of parallels in terms of the cultural experience of people who are living in poverty and people who live with intellectual disability, largely because, amongst other things, we force many people with intellectual disabilities to be poor because we don't allow them into the workforce. I feel really strongly, and I think really proud of the work that we did with the Living Archives project around the Our Stories component. I really think there's a deep and intrinsic value in having people tell their own stories, particularly a group of people whose stories have almost always been told by others. I think that it's been extraordinary in terms of my own personal development, if you will, to build relationships with people who have been identified as victims and to be with them through a process where they really actively and in a public way embrace their own survivorship. For me, it was really important to think about this particular piece of the project, the Our Stories Told piece, as collaborative and collective. I think largely because I felt a great deal of personal and psychological unease at the idea of doing what often sort of traditional historians or researchers will do in terms of taking information and presenting it, but maybe losing some of that important nuance in the face of a piece of history. So having survivors tell their own stories seemed like a much more ethical piece of research for us to do. I was also particularly moved by the idea that survivors would be involved in the editing process of their own stories, so that there was never a sense that this wasn't a mutual process. But and I think people with intellectual disabilities rarely have that opportunity to have full ownership of a piece of their history, of their own personal story. A number of the people who gave us survivor testimonies, it was later discovered that in fact, they didn't have an intellectual disability. For me, that's no, I guess, more horrendous a crime than the sterilizations and the aberrant treatment that people who did in fact have intellectual disabilities experienced. For me, horrendous treatment of a fellow human being is horrendous regardless of how we try to label it. People with intellectual disabilities, I think, have really struggled with finding safe places to have those more normative identities that the rest of us might take for granted. For me in this research project, I was really, I think, focused on new forms of eugenics and the importance of us engaging in generating information and creating public awareness about the circumstances of parents who have intellectual disabilities. They are disturbingly overrepresented in the child welfare system. Our structural human service barriers can interfere with their capacity not just to parent or to even consider that kind of identity, but even to consider relationships and partnerships around love. People can still be prohibited from marrying, for example, or having long-term romantic or intimate relationships of various kinds. So I think the testimonies that we took from parents with intellectual disabilities speak both to the systemic injustices that they experience as parents who are labeled with disability in our systems, but we were very fortunate to speak to some parents who had, in spite of, IQs that were in the 50s, are raising their children successfully with, modest supports, and they demonstrate clearly for the world at large that intellectual disability does not impede being able to love, being able to parent. I think the argument that we can support people to be fully employed, to marry, to have children, is very, cost ineffective. It costs too much money. But, I don't think actually that we can say that with a great degree of accuracy. When we congregate people in institutions, as we have, or in large-scale group homes or smaller group homes, you could articulate that costs drop. But what we aren't doing then is measuring that cost across different government ministries. People who are unhappy, people who are oppressed, have health problems, they have mental health problems, they find themselves in hospital for acute physical conditions and mental health conditions more often. The cost per day of supporting someone in a community in parenting, for example, or in a job, versus the cost of a hospital bed is substantially more. The cost of us not providing good, healthful, human rights-based supports to people in community can result in people ending up in jail because of the way we sort of criminalize disability in the same way we historically criminalize poverty. And those costs are more. And those are the money costs, the things that people who mean well will talk about, but those don't measure the costs that are less overt, like what is the cost to our society as a whole to create a caste system that allows us to cast aside certain sorts of people and still consider, and still in some sort of, rational way talk about us living in a democratic society, because I don't think those two things can coexist. In my darkest hours, I often wonder how much of a caste system we have created around people with intellectual disabilities. And in those dark moments, I wonder if we've done it on purpose. In my lighter moments, I think we've created a caste system around people with intellectual disabilities out of ignorance. Because whilst we have been forced through advocacy and increased knowledge to identify different faiths as being uniquely valuable, different cultures as being uniquely valuable, we have managed through both the medical and moral models to marry ourselves to the idea that intellectual disability is about, imperfection and permanent childhood. And so we don't really think about what is lost when it comes to people with intellectual disabilities. In my work, I think one of the issues that has pained me and troubled me most profoundly has been around our treatment of families who have infants, and sometimes that diagnosis comes pre-birth, who are identified as having intellectual disabilities. I think we radically strip away from those families and those infants the joy of childhood, the normalcy of play. And we insert this notion of sort of like professional remediation. And we don't just destroy sort of the childhood experience of that child who is labeled, we destroy the childhood experience and then often the adult experience of that entire family. We do away with the idea of parental expertise, that you can have 6 kids and be a great parent, but if you have a child born with trisomy 21, suddenly you don't know how to parent anymore. And then we continue that message from the lists of, the social worker in hospital giving you the list of the things your child won't do, and here's your list of support groups, to here's the specialized early intervention programs, to here's the special school, right? To, you can't expect, right, that child is going to speak. And so we set whole generations of families in opposition to a culture that won't allow them to be who they actually are outside of the professional interventions. I think is hugely damaging. I've dealt with quite a few doctors over my professional career who have given advice to families about, pressure to get prenatal testing, pressure to have amniocentesis, pressure to head to the genetics clinic. And I think one of the sort of most damning indictments of our time is that so often the advice coming from those sorts of genetic counseling clinics or doctors is, not a message about the success of so many people with that particular diagnosis, but with the ramifications, right? Like the language is all built around the idea of hopelessness and imperfection. And so often families will be counseled, sometimes fairly aggressively about terminating that pregnancy and trying again. And I have personally worked with families where, based on their own particular moral stance, they refused to do so and met with extremely punitive behavior from their medical professionals, hence, from that time forward. And I think one of the troubles with the medical model is it's built on the idea that it's about what you can fix or what is made to work, but there's not really a clear definition of what works or who works. In my experience, I met with a family a number of years ago where they were a blended family. Later in life, they chose to bring another baby into their family. The mom was heavily pressured to get genetic testing because she was, I think, 42. And when she succumbed to that pressure, and in conversation with me, she said, I really don't want to do it, but I felt like he's a doctor, so he has to know more than I do. And they were given a diagnosis pre-birth of Down syndrome for their child, and when they met with the genetics counselor, there was I think sort of like heavy influence from the parents' perspective, like this child will be a burden, this child will likely never be able to live on their own. There's a broad spectrum of the way Down syndrome will present itself in a human being, but, when they said they were going to have the baby, this mom really articulated the heavy degree of judgment, and immediately there was this sort of pathologizing of what their future would look like, and the doctor was like, I think you're really making a big mistake, and the social worker, you're going to need all this extra help. These are two parents who had, between them, raised 5 children. But this particular child was not going to be sort of a welcome addition. And I remember sitting with her having a cup of coffee, and the baby at this time was 4 months old, and she'd approached me because she had heard that as a consultant I could provide her some assistance in finding just the right early intervention program for her daughter. And I remember sitting there, and when I met her, I was like, what a beautiful baby. And she started to cry, and I thought I'd done something terrible. And what had in fact happened was I was the first person outside of her family who congratulated her and told her she had a lovely daughter. So her experience of choosing to celebrate the birth of this child was sort of dashed at each turn. And in the end, my advice to her, which was, I'm sure some people would say it was terrible, but what I said to her was, do you really need to worry about an early intervention program, or do you want to just go have fun with your kid? She's lovely. And I know that was the first time she had heard that. For me, a powerful example of the cultural oppression of people with intellectual disabilities is the experience of many children in our school system. There's been a lot of advocacy work in the last 20 years to try to see kids with intellectual disabilities included, but the experience of the segregated classroom, the special bus, the special ed hallway is still, I think, really prevalent in our community. And whilst I think that it's, a very sort of isolating and culturally oppressive experience for children with intellectual disabilities, they probably knew walking into that school that they weren't going to be regarded as the same as the other students. But I worry also, I guess more in some ways, about the children who aren't labeled as disabled in those school systems learning about children like that, and us systematizing racism, if you will, in generation after generation of children who are learning in our cultural institutions that some people don't carry the same worth. Increasingly, as society evolves, we have stories of victory or survivorship that I think are really powerful. We work for a young mother who, when we met her, had been homeless, had her son apprehended, was pregnant again, and child welfare was warming up to take away her second child. And of course, the tool used to address why this young mom shouldn't be able to raise her children was her IQ. Now, they weren't actually, interestingly enough, engaging in discussion about the fact that she'd grown up in poverty, that she'd been neglected and in the foster system herself, that she didn't have a lot of parenting skills but had some capacity to learn them. Essentially, when we sat down with the psychologist who did her assessments, he took her through a series of assessments and said, basically, you're this stupid. You have an IQ of 56, like you should have staff all the time. And these are actually quotes that this man gave her. She was devastated. And through really sort of hard-fought work by her lawyer, and she chose to, work with us to, find stable housing, manage her addiction and other issues that she had. This is a woman now, 5 years later, who, with an IQ of 56, is raising 2 children successfully with 30 hours of support per week. When we met her, we were told she wouldn't get the kids and she would still require 24-hour staffing supports. And she's got, her child is gifted. Her eldest child is now in kindergarten, is getting A's in school. She attends parent-teacher meetings. She does all the things that moms want to do for their kids. And it, you know, it was a hard-won victory, but she's an extraordinary mom. I think one of the really neat experiences of doing work with parents who have intellectual disabilities is hearing from them what they consider to be the wins of being able to keep their kids. One of the dads that we work with talks a lot about how he's able to provide the things for his children that he never had. And it doesn't have anything to do with his intellectual disability. It has to do with him having found meaningful employment and being able to buy the things that his kids need. He talks a lot about how he remembers the experience of being in segregated education and being called stupid and retarded and short bus, and how his children are in regular classes and how proud he is of that. And those stories are really, they teach us the value of what others see in their own experience and how unique those are. Those wouldn't have necessarily been the things that I would have, in knowing him, thought were the biggest successes. I first learned about eugenics in a specific way, I think, in high school. But it was only talked about in terms of what the Nazis did. And it wasn't until I moved to Canada and then to Alberta in 1986 and was in university, and I took a disability studies class where they talked about the Eugenics Act. Up until that time, I really only thought it was something that the Nazis had done. I think I was sort of like intellectually offended. And then a few months after that, with my university class, I took a trip to what is now called Missioner Centre. At the time was called the Provincial Training School, and it still had about 1,600 residents at that time. And it was at that moment, I think, the connection to eugenics and the horrendous behavior of human beings that became really personal to me.